Welcome to The Pillars, the podcast of the 363rd ISR Wing of the United States Air Force. I'm Chaplain Jim Bridgham.
I'm Dr. Jerry Walker.
And I'm Sergeant Ackerberg.
On each episode of The Pillars, we find a brief resilience topic so you can practically fix any potential roadblocks you encounter and finish a better wingman, airman, and leader. What's today's topic?
So today we're continuing our discussion of the 4 pillars of good leaders as espoused by Lieutenant General Stephen Quast, the current commander of AATC. And last time we talked about nobility. Today we're going to talk about what in some senses is the opposite of nobility, and that's humility. And Chaplain, why is humility important?
Well, it's a right understanding of who you are. Sometimes we have a wrong definition of humility, but from a faith perspective, these leaders, these sages in early times would come in and recognize the gifts they had without comparing them to other people. Mm-hmm. So for instance, let's say it was Moses. He would say, I'm a great leader in this respect. I'm a poor leader in that respect, but not comparing him, saying I'm a better leader than this person or that. So for us, and I'll use me as an example, I enjoy speaking. I love speaking. Mm-hmm. You can put me in front of an audience and it would be great. That's just something I really enjoy, and it's a gift. So I can say I am a good public speaker. But I also recognize that I am maybe a poor writer. So when the 5 Minutes to Thrive, our weekly document that we send out, you guys write, you're way better writers than I am. So that's just your gifting. And I can say that. And it's not a comparison thing. It's just recognizing where our gifts lie. So for us, why it's so important is to recognize who you are, the gifts you have, and how you can impact your community, state, nation, your family, and to use your gifts without muting them. One thing that's a big passion area for me on this is there's some unfortunate misinterpretations of Scripture where people make themselves feel, they put themselves down. And I'd use the term Ned Flanders-isms to make themselves like the guy from The Simpsons, essentially masking their gifts so that they look weak or meek. And that's really not what it is. It's bringing our gifts to the table and using them in whatever context you're in.
I like that perspective because I think a lot of times we associate humility or being humble with the idea of meekness or even weakness. Mm-hmm. So somebody is humble not because they're not trying to boast, but because they really don't have anything to boast about. That's certainly not the case. And what you're saying is that the issue here comes with comparison. Mm-hmm. I really like that because it's almost human nature to compare ourselves to other people. In fact, in psychology, part of the way that we know how to act in certain situations, how we understand our social standing within any group of people is by that comparison. So we're always trying to do our best, to be our best, to work on our weaknesses, and we measure our success a lot of times not in how far we've come, but how much we meet up with the socially accepted standard. Easy one is physical fitness. So there's a lot of standards out there that give us very poor objects of comparison. So that even though we may make a lot of ground in our own personal regards, we can't meet up to these unrealistic standards. Mm-hmm. And so that's where comparison can become an issue. Conversely, people who do really well and do feel that they measure up very favorably in comparison to other folks can fall into the pride pitfall.
That's right.
And so humility is eschewing all of that to say, instead of comparing you to me or me to Sergeant Ackerberg or you guys to each other, that we look for what our own weaknesses are, what our own strengths are, and rather than compensating for our weaknesses, we leverage those strengths to our advantage and to the advantage of other people.
Correct. But it can be a tightrope because you could easily fall into pride. So just what I said earlier, well, I'm a good speaker. I really enjoy speaking. Well, that could turn very prideful and say, I am the best speaker ever. And that's just not true. And if you've listened to these podcasts, you have enough evidence to prove that. My thing, though, is just saying not to compare, but just to say, I have a gift, and this is a gift I can use. You have a gift, and I know your gifts, and Sergeant Ackerberg's gifts that you guys can use.
So to me, correct me if I'm wrong, it almost sounds like having an opinion about a strength or weakness, but not judgment. It's not necessarily a good or bad.
Okay.
So when we look at strength or weakness. But you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in my mind, when I think of humility, I think it's a fact that we formulate or an opinion that we formulate, maybe not so much fact, but then you're not assigning a good or bad. There isn't a judgment to it. I know I say to you, Dr. Walker, you write 5 Minutes to Thrive so much better than me, right? But I also tend to minimize my ability as well. But that's because I've attached a judgment to my side.
Right.
At least that's how, when I think humility for me.
And it's part of that comparison
Yes.
piece, too.
Yes.
And so I think that's good, though, because if you're not being judgmental either about yourself or other people, then you can actually have a more realistic understanding of where you fall along the spectrum. So it can help us actually be aware of not necessarily our weaknesses, but those quote-unquote opportunities for improvement, right? So if we're not being judgmental towards ourselves, we're taking an honest and realistic look at some areas where we could stand to make some changes, we could stand to improve, then I think that's going to help us, rather than feel ashamed or embarrassed about those things, to actually make progress on them.
Well, and one piece of humility and growing as a leader is growing in all four pillars. And a principle of spiritual growth accepted by many faiths is to remove judgment from situations, to look at them objectively and just realize it's an experience you're having to grow. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a right and wrong, but to realize if you're going through something, that it's just a situation that you can grow from. That's it. Whether it's removing the good or bad designation.
And this can be a challenge, especially for leaders, because they're called upon to almost be infallible. So when we look at our leaders, or when our leaders are trying to present this persona of who they are and why they're worthy of being followed, whether they have 3 people that they're leading or an entire wing, they want people to feel like they can trust in their decisions. And when we inevitably screw up, because we're all human, we all make mistakes, how that leader navigates that potential mistake or that failure, I think says a lot about their character and can actually tip the balance in terms of how I regard them. I'll never forget this. I was working with some folks in EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, and their commander had come in for a down day. It was a resilience day. And so the commander was talking to them about some of the personal difficulties that he'd had in his life, and how that led him to go seek mental health counseling. And he was very open and honest about how he was affected by certain things that had happened in his personal life. And he talked about what it took for him to actually grow and to get over it. And he very bluntly said, there should be no shame attached to this. If you guys are struggling, come talk to me, talk to each other, go to mental health if you need it. It's absolutely acceptable. And I'll tell you, in that moment, I looked around the room, and all these guys were just looking at their commander with this awe and this awesome respect. It was really cool to see because of the way that he had talked about some of these struggles he's had in the past. We could call them shortcomings, but I don't even think that's appropriate. But in the eyes of those guys, they were seeing this person being human and being personal to them. And in humanizing himself to them, he gained so much more respect that if he just tried to present this persona of this austere, powerful leader with no weaknesses. And so I think that's the challenge that we have as leaders, is to be personable with our folks, to be able to admit when we make mistakes or when we have some shortcomings that either we're working on right now or that we've had to work on in the past, and then serve as that example to other people's, and do it in this vein of humility, not pridefulness.
Yeah, I would imagine as a leader in that position, it'd be really difficult knowing also what's the line to share and what's the line not to share, right? We want to send the message of, hey, I noticed I was down, I was weak, or I just wasn't myself, maybe not weak in that term, but share that with them to let them know, but hey, I'm also seeking services to get better, to show strength and growth, and to let his folks know that it's okay to have that moment where we can take a knee and then we're going to get back up. But it could have gone, if he had gone, right, we don't want to go too far,
right,
but we don't also want to be too firm, right? And so there's this thin line to tread for humility, for what I see. It's very interesting.
It comes down to what's most appropriate in that situation. And I think a good way that you can tease that out is to question your motivation for why you're doing certain things. And this applies in a lot of different examples when it comes to how do you curb your own pride. If you think back to, why am I saying this? What am I hoping to accomplish by talking about this? Am I talking about my accomplishments or these letters after my name to try to impress other people or to reinforce my sense of authority? Or am I doing it to try to lend credibility to what I'm saying next? Those are two very different motivations, and most of the time people can see through those types of things. So I think that's a good point that you made.
So if someone wants to grow in humility, so they're listening to this podcast and they want to be more humble, I guess is a good way to put it. and they don't want to just make humble pie. They don't want to have that. They want to exhibit humility as a leader. What's a good way for them to start? Let's say they've examined their motivations. So what else would they do?
Well, I actually really like a few books by Brene Brown. She writes extensively on shame and talks about what it's like to embrace shame, to embrace the discomfort of shame, and use that as a point for growth. And so she has a number of books out there, Brene Brown, even TED Talks that I think are really interesting and can help us reveal some of those things that are maybe keeping us from being humble, from allowing ourselves to be humble.
Which is an interesting point, because she also has a piece where she doesn't want to be small. She talks about not allowing yourself to be small, like famously small, because she's a shame researcher, and so she wanted her research to be out there. She wanted people to know her research, but she herself wanted to stay small and safe. And so she was avoiding, I would say, in her humility, right? Like, she was staying on the safer, quieter side, but she did want the research to get out there, so because she wanted that to be known. But so that's a fine line also to tread, I think, in her motivation. She was motivated to get that information out on shame, but then she herself struggled with her humility, as far as, like, she didn't want to be, like, in the limelight.
Well, and I heard her say, don't puff up, don't shrink.
Yes.
She had a statement saying now where she goes into a place, don't puff up, don't shrink. And that's what humility is at its core. You don't shrink, you don't puff up. You're just right down the center. And just acknowledge your gifts and share them. And again, look at your motivations, look at your identity, look at your gifts. And the last thing we want you to do is to walk away from of anyone telling you to exhibit humility and you to hide your gifts. Like, you were brought into the Air Force for a reason, to use the gifts, talents, skills, and abilities to help our nation win wars, but also to help your airmen, help your wingmen right next to you. So we just want you to use that as a leader at any level.
And that's where the nobility piece comes in that we talked about last time. So it might seem at first glance that nobility and humility contradict each other, but in actuality, they seem to run parallel.
Well, we want to thank you for listening to The Pillars, the podcast of the 363rd ISR Wing of the United States Air Force. I'm Chaplain Jim Bridgham.
I'm Dr. Jerry Walker.
And I'm Sergeant Ackerberg.
Until next time, if you need us, please reach out to us on the global address list. Finally, thanks for what you do for our nation, and we hope you have a great day.